What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about how the channel's going, more or less after 200k subs just earlier this week, though most of this video will be a QA, as a lot of what I had in mind for this video was actually asked in the questions people responded with when I made a community post asking for questions. Nonetheless, though, I have a few things to talk about, and I thought it would make a nice break from all the Baldur's Gate 3 content while we're waiting on the launch for that, to sort of give a channel update how things are going since I hit 100k subs last Thanksgiving, as my audience has effectively doubled since then. And as I like to keep the focus primarily on video games, I don't exactly make a lot of content talking specifically about the channel that often. But to kick this off before we go any further, for starters, just thank you. If you're watching this, chances are you are subscribed, as videos like this don't typically go much beyond your own subscriber base, so to speak. But really, thank you. I really couldn't be here doing this without you guys, at least not for a living. And while this is my full-time job these days, for 6 years when I started the channel in 2015, it was really just a hobby that I sometimes had time for. And occasionally I'd make like $100 every couple months type of thing. But over time, I started focusing a lot on Divinity, and I noticed people really enjoyed my content on that series, and a lot of that content really helped me find a feel for how to make videos, how to present them, and then that led into Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, which is where I finally started getting enough headway to actually do this full time. And it's been a wild ride since then, as you might imagine. And before we dive fully into the QA, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how this year's been going since 100k subs, what my favorite moments have been, that kind of thing. As you might have guessed, this year has been going very, very well. The early summer months were a little bit slow as there wasn't a ton going on, but surprisingly, so far this year, February was actually the biggest month I had, which I would imagine is down to some of the high-profile game releases that were around that time. That said, July, leading up to the Baldur's Gate 3 launch, with all of its content centered around that, has been very much so pushing for the best month this year. We'll have to see how the last roughly 10 days of it pan out, but as it stands, July is definitely looking to be as good as February was. Which is really exciting for me because, if you couldn't tell by the entire channel, I'm incredibly passionate about video games and RPGs in particular, CRPGs especially, and getting to live my dream of talking to people about those video games, reviewing them, giving people my opinions on them, is very much so a dream come true. In fact, just to share a small story from when I was a kid, back when I was like 10 or 11, I kind of already knew that video games were what I wanted, you know what I mean? I loved them, I wanted to play them, and despite growing up very, very poor, I really just dug into any game I could get my hands on, and at that young age, I even thought it would be a really cool idea to write guides for video games. Not entirely dissimilar from how I do it now, but more in the context of old printed video game strategy guides. So I made these signs to hang up in a trailer park I lived in, actually, that if they needed any help with a video game, they could come to me about it, and I would play it and write guides for it. And unsurprisingly, my parents weren't keen on that idea by any means, which was probably the right move. But my point is, even at that age, I knew that this, in some capacity, is what I really wanted to do for a living. And while it took me a long time to get here with several other jobs that aren't really much of anything to do with video games, honestly, the fact that I kept this going and that passion continued until I got to a place where I could do this means so very much to me. And because of that, I really can't thank the people who actually watch every video, leave the likes, the comments, etc. I can't thank you guys enough, which is why I do it every day. That said, from here I want to talk a little bit about my favorite moments of gaming so far in 2023, or at least since my last update like this back in November of last year, 2022. And I've got a few, but I want to start it off with Forspoken, actually. While that isn't, I would say, an amazing game or anything, don't worry. I am actually incredibly proud of my review for that game. And this kind of extends to Redfall because it was a similar situation there where the game came out, you had all these people trashing it and tearing it apart for one little thing, and in spite of that, I was able to complete that game to 100%, make a review out of it that I feel was fair and objective and focused on what the game did well and the things it didn't. And in that regard, the game's biggest problem, in my opinion, was the fact that it just ran very, very poorly. There are other aspects of it that weren't great, of course, which is all outlined in that review. If you want my full thoughts, go watch it. But I'm proud of that review because despite everything that was going on surrounding its release and the conversation around it, so to speak, I was able to make a review that was objective and called out the things that game did well on top of the things that it didn't. And when the conversation around a game has turned into mostly just trashing it and everyone saying how bad it is, I think it becomes even more important to be a sort of level-headed voice in those conversations, especially as someone who's actually reviewing the games and being able to give an objective view on it, which includes the things it does well, even if you don't wind up recommending it. And because of that, that review even now is sitting on like a 98% like to dislike ratio, and it's one I'm really proud of. That said, a couple of my other favorite moments, one much more recently, was Aliens Dark Descent. This was I wouldn't exactly say indie, but a relatively small TRPG project that had some unique aspects. It used like real time with pause, which is rare in that genre. And it was just something I was interested in covering, as I play a lot of those kinds of games. But that game turned out to be a ton of fun, and especially using the Aliens franchise, I think it was a lot more fun than most people expected, which is why it did very well critically, and I reflected that in my review. But then, because of how good it was, it kind of got some traction under it, which led to both the review doing really well, and because it was a smaller game that passed a lot of people by, even some of the bigger channels were pointing people to my review of that game because they thought it was a great review. It was a really cool moment for me to see a smaller game that I covered get so much attention, and well-deserved attention at that. But watching that game go from just a small game I reviewed to a game suddenly everyone was like, oh wow, this is really good, and this is a really good review on top of that, was really fun for me. Now, the last favorite moment I want to leave you guys with for this year was actually the Diablo 4 launch. And this isn't so much the content I made, and while I am proud of the content I made for this, especially because my review for that one wasn't my normal 100% stuff, as that's not really possible for like an online service kind of game. My favorite moment about the D4 launch was more personal. I've talked about this on the channel a lot, but the Diablo franchise means a lot to me. It's a game series that I played kind of religiously as a kid, as Diablo 2 is one of the very few games I was able to play during specific times in my life, but finally getting another Diablo game to play and check out on launch, with it actually being a decent game on top of that, really let myself almost be a kid for the launch of that one. I ordered a big pizza, got a 2-liter, and played Diablo until like 2 or 3 in the morning, and it kind of made me feel like I was 12 again. So irrespective of the game and how it's going, how the continuous patches are going to be, the launch of that game and also being able to cover it was a ton of fun for me. It's easily one of my favorite moments so far this year on a more personal level. Now, before we jump into the QA, I do want to talk a little bit about the future of the channel. Nothing too terribly dramatic, I would say, just a few things to know. Going forward with the content, nothing's likely to change here, but I think it's important to call out that I'm always refining how I make videos, and I think probably the most recent and ongoing example of this is my class series of Baldur's Gate 3. You see, as I mentioned way earlier, one of the big things that put this channel on people's radar initially was Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, and I would cover all the classes for that game. And while it was mostly during the beta and I was trying to give people an idea of what to expect, the channel was in many ways still kind of trying to find its footing at that time. So while I'm proud of having gone out there and made those videos, and I still think they were good for what they were at the time they were made, I took a lot of feedback from those videos, and I was like, man, if I ever do something like this again, here's a few ideas I would run with to change some things, talk more about what these classes are meant to be fantasy-wise, that kind of thing. And I actually got the chance to apply a lot of that to my Baldur's Gate 3 class series, which has done incredibly well. I've only got 5 of the 12 classes done, and just those videos already have like 400,000 views, and people have really responded positively to the changes I had in mind. So things like that are how I plan on refining videos in the future. Just now that I have more time to do this as a living, take the lessons I've learned and simply try to make better content with it. But beyond that, the type of content I make will likely continue to be the same. Guides, reviews, all that usual stuff. Because that's what I enjoy making the most. I don't ever plan on focusing on just one game forever, as I think that's a good way to kill a channel, as eventually people will stop talking about that game. But as people who've been around a while, as many of the people watching this video are, I'm sure, have probably noticed, I'm just really passionate about games in general, and I want to play as many of them as I can. So while I might focus very heavily on one game for a time while it's relevant to do so, I do like covering single-player RPGs where I can kind of do everything, put it down, and move on. That's kind of a big reason I moved away from MMOs, which I also used to cover a bit when the channel first got started, because there's no real end to those, and for someone like myself, I kind of just get bored with stuff like that after a while. But I will always be trying to refine what I do and make it better as much as I can. That said, one big change that's coming up in the future, for sure, is probably not right away, but in a few months from now, probably when things slow down a little bit, as July has been busy, August will be busy, September is going to be also busy with just tons of game releases. So probably around October, I do plan on a small schedule change, because reality is I've been doing this 7 days a week for years, and that is the work it took to get here and make this livable. And in many ways, I structured my life around YouTube in order to make that happen, which has clearly been fairly successful. But while YouTube has allowed me to spend more time with my son than I probably would have ever gotten to otherwise, in fact, no one has spent more time with my son than me, as I've gotten to work from home and hang out with him all day. Sometimes we play video games together even, and that's been great. But reality is he starts school in fall this year, so simply by the nature of that, I'm going to have less time with him. And to make sure I still get proper quality time with my son, I have to pull back from that 7 days a week. However, what I don't know is what that's going to look like upload-wise, because realistically, I'm going to have even more time during the week now, which means I might still be able to upload 7 days a week. So realistically, people might not even notice a change. I'm not sure yet, but my plan as it stands is to not work, frankly, on Sunday in particular, which would normally mean I won't have an upload on Mondays outside of some critical situation where I need to have something uploaded, or I simply had it prepared well ahead of time like earlier in the week. But either way, in the next couple of months, I do plan on there being a change to the schedule where I'm going to be dropping back from working all the time to probably like 6 days a week, which is primarily so I can spend time with my son, but realistically it's also probably best for my own health as well. And I'll probably provide an update on this a little closer to the time it comes to actually make that change. But at the very least, I wanted to let people know that come like September, Monday is going to be a much more variable day in terms of whether or not I actually upload something. That said, with all of that stuff out of the way, let's actually dive into the Q&A portion of this video. As I said, I made a community post for the 200k subs, asked people if they had any questions that I could answer, and many people responded. So, Pikasaurus asks, when writing my reviews, how do I decide what's important, useful to include, and do I have any criteria, or is it just sort of a gut check? It is, in fact, both of those things. So, if you've watched my reviews for a long time, there is sort of a format that I use, and things that fit within that format are absolutely stuff that I'm looking for. I also make a point to check things like settings, technical problems the game may or may not have, as those will very much so be on the forefront of people's minds when they pick up a new game. And while that's all well and good, it's also important to keep in mind when I'm playing a game that if anything bothers me in particular, or if there's anything that stands out as really great at the same time, that's important to include in a review. So it's, again, a mix of both of those things. At Jade Grief asks, outside of my review schedule, what, if any, are some games you just play for yourself for fun and not for a future video? This is mostly ARPGs, things like Diablo in particular. I really enjoy playing those because it's quick stuff that I can sort of pick up and put down very easily, and I don't have to get too involved with. And then every once in a while, I'll jump into one of my older favorite games now, such as even Wrath of the Righteous. I'll occasionally play for an hour or two here and there. I might jump into like Skyrim sometimes. I play a lot of Pokemon games, believe it or not, and that's mostly because my son is really into them. He's kind of at that age, you know? And while I still enjoy Pokemon games, it's really fun to play those with my son in particular, and he's also really into Sonic, so I've got a few of those that we'll play together. Josh Cunningham asks, I've mentioned a few times about being a father and changing the way I experience viewing games. In a wider sense, how has that affected my lifestyle and the way you enjoy games in general? Well, I think the key thing to keep in mind is that I am a father, and despite as much content as I upload, One thing people may or may not notice is that I almost never post anything labor intensive earlier in the week, and that's generally because when I have my son, it's harder to do those more labor intensive things, and obviously there are certain games I wouldn't want my son to see because he's very young still, so a particularly gory game or something like that aren't things I would let him even accidentally watch me play, and in that way I would say the experience has certainly changed a bit, but I wouldn't really say it's changed the way I enjoy games in general, because I still kind of enjoy the stuff I enjoy, though I will say it's given me an appreciation for games I might not have cared about otherwise. Like Biomutant was probably the first game that my son ever really lit up about because of all the sort of colorful animal type characters. He was really into Biomutant, and it was the kind of game I could let him play with me while I reviewed it. And for stuff like that, he loves to sit in my lap and press the jump button for me, that type of stuff. So there are certainly experiences that have changed, but by and large I wouldn't say it's vastly different or anything, but I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that I get to do this for a living, as opposed to having to go work somewhere and then come home. And then at Mekosin asks, just for pure curiosity, will we see your face? So my face actually isn't a secret. It's probably not in this video, but the reason I don't put myself in videos typically is because it makes them more difficult to edit. Because I upload content every day, it's actually important to me that that process be very streamlined. And the thing about putting your face in things is that it's actually a lot more difficult to edit that because you have to make sure things like the audio matches your lip movements, for instance. And because I cover video games, it's just easier generally to slap gameplay over what I'm saying and not have to worry about it. However, because I do that so much, people tend to think that my face isn't anywhere to be found, but that's not true, actually. You can see exactly what I look like in multiple live streams. I did an entire live stream playthrough of Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous where I'm on camera the whole time. You can find that right on the channel's homepage, but if you just check out any of my live streams, you'll be able to see me, really. Though I admit I don't do a lot of streaming, so this is an easy thing to miss for sure. And then at Elgar T asks, what is, in my opinion, the most important aspect of video games that gives them unique value as a pastime activity or even an art form? So I think there's a few things that you could say in regards to this. I would say when I was younger, for instance, it allowed me to sort of put my troubles down and pretend I was somewhere else. So the escapism you also mentioned in this comment. But as an adult, I would say there's a lot of value in getting outside of your own comfort zone. Learning about other people or different approaches to things, even if you don't agree with them or they're not something you wind up enjoying, I think that as an experience is really good. Because as a person, I think when you stop engaging with new ideas is when you stop growing. And video games as a form of media provide a very convenient, interactive way to experience exactly that. Viewpoints you might not have thought of, roles you might not otherwise take on, and where other forms of media simply allow you to either watch or potentially read it, video games are what allow you to actually experience those things through the lens of someone else or in some other capacity. Basically just the interactivity to it. And that to me is probably the most important aspect of video games. But I do want to leave this particular comment with the fact that I also don't think video games need to justify themselves as anything other than fun. While games can be many things to many people, they are absolutely allowed to just be fun. And as the world moves towards everyone being as productive as possible at all times, which is even something myself am certainly guilty of, it's good to have things that you simply enjoy for the sake of enjoying them. They don't necessarily need to have some bigger meaning all the time. And luckily for us, video games can do all of those things. Moving on though, at Nuance says, with 2 questions, what are the lessons I've learned so far that have helped me reach my YouTube goals, and how have you dealt with doubts or moments when your motivation was lacking? So lessons that have helped me reach my YouTube goals are largely around how to present content. If you were to go back and look through a lot of my older videos, the core ideas of what I was doing there and what I do now really aren't that different. What has changed is how I present them. What might make someone want to watch them, and what makes a good video, that kind of thing. And while I have gone to great lengths to not deal with things like clickbait and try to keep the channel just as upfront and open as possible about things like sponsors, etc. The biggest lesson by far for me was how to present the passion I already had in a way that was useful to other people, because that's what's going to get them to watch a video. Now, as for the second question, I deal with doubts and lack of motivation by just making more videos. Oftentimes, I feel like videos might not do particularly well, and then I put them out there and they either do exactly that, not well, or they surprise me and do really well. So when it comes to doubts, I would say the main thing for me is I just keep doing it in spite of those things, because the worst that can happen is that I fail, and if you are afraid of failing, this probably isn't something you should do, because sometimes things fail. Just recently, actually, to give an example, I put out a video on Xenonauts 2, and if you look at every other video from around that time frame, that video did not do well. I think right now it's sitting at like 20k views, but both the video before it and after both have over 100,000. One of them has over 200,000. So things like that are unfortunate, but if you're going to let something like that stop you, putting yourself out there publicly might not be for you. But I would mostly just encourage people to not let the idea of failing at something they haven't even tried stop you from trying. Now, as for my own motivation, this might get a little bit sappy, but when my motivation is lacking, I mostly look towards my own son. As I've mentioned in videos here and there, I had a hard time growing up. I was poor, I was homeless at one point, and for much of my life, I very much so felt like my dreams were never going to happen or they were out of reach. And sometimes, now that I'm here, it still feels very surreal. But reality is, I made it here, and I always want to set an example for my son that if you work hard enough and you actually try, your dreams might not be as far away as you think they are in your head. So when my motivation is lacking, I simply remind myself that I want to set an example for my son so I can teach him to reach for the things he wants out of life. But that heaviness out of the way, @Moosey Mike asks, do I check out achievements beforehand so that I can effectively cross them off the list as I'm playing, or do I play through the game blindly for maybe immersion, and only after that do I double back and grab achievements? So it's, again, just kind of both. It really depends on the game. If it's a really old game, yeah, I'll probably do some research on the achievements, see what's what, how many playthroughs it's likely to take, that kind of thing, and I'll sort of have a game plan. For newer games, it's touch and go. Sometimes I don't really need to at all, like the game's so simple, it's just not necessary. Sometimes I just don't have enough information ahead of time to do any real planning. But for those who are unaware, if you get a review copy of something on Steam, you can just see the achievements early. I can't show you an example of this for obvious reasons, but when you get a review copy of something, Steam effectively just marks it as you have access to this, so you can actually just pull up the achievement list like you would any other game. But in either case, after doing this as much as I do, you kind of get a feel for these things. Especially modern games, most of the achievements are really straightforward because they kind of know people want to clear something out without necessarily doing every impossible feat. So in a lot of cases, the achievements aren't even the pressing part of the review, believe it or not. @BattleRicky asks, have I played a game so good it made it hard for me to review other games, meaning that I didn't want to put it down, it was so good? This has happened occasionally where I would have wanted to continue playing a game for a while, but it is pretty rare. More often than not, when I 100% a game and put out the review, I'm more or less over that game. I'm ready to move on to something else. One of the ways I avoid burnout, so to speak, is I like to change genres after a while, or at least kind of switch them up, so to speak, and after 100% on something, I'm usually done with it. But yeah, occasionally that does happen. As an example, Diablo 4 recently, I did what I could there and reviewed it and moved on, but realistically, I would have liked to have played it in a dedicated fashion for a bit longer, and I'll probably check out the new seasons a little bit and play it on my own time a little bit, but more often than not, it's not really an issue. @Caterade has 2 questions. If I could create my own CRPG, what would it be? And what's a CRPG I'd recommend that gets mixed reviews from critics? So as for creating my own CRPG, this might be a bit of a cop-out answer, but I simply wouldn't. And that's mostly because actual game development sounds like a very grueling job where you're very beholden to other people. What I do might be a bit of a grueling job in terms of hours, but I'm only answering to me. But that combined with my own time and salaried jobs dealing with other people, it would just be a hard pass for me to make something like that. But assuming that wasn't an issue, even still, I probably wouldn't want to create my own so much as I would desperately want to know what happens with Pillars of Eternity 3. But as for A CRPG I'd recommend that got mixed reviews, I would say most modern CRPGs generally get pretty good reviews. You don't see a lot of mixed in that regard. But one indie CRPG that is worth taking a look at, I think, is called Black Geyser: Couriers of Darkness. It's an indie game, it's certainly a little janky, but it has a really cool couple of concepts around greed and things like that I think can be pretty cool. Believe it or not, most CRPGs don't get a lot of mixed reviews. I think Kingmaker springs to mind, but even that game has like a mostly positive rating on Steam, for instance. Now, once you start looking at the older games, some of those have mixed reviews, but it's more about like the mechanics of the game just being very dated than it is any real problems. So it's actually kind of hard to pinpoint anyone that genuinely has mixed reviews. Next up, at Video7409 has several questions, mostly around how I go about getting 100% alongside how I structure videos. The first question, though, is how do I think about hitting all the achievements for a game if I have built out a week to 100% it? So an important thing to remember here is I'm not actually up against any sort of timeline. Any timeline or deadline that is there is self-imposed. I might want to have something done in a certain amount of time, but I can move it if necessary. The nice thing about the reviews after 100% is no one really expects them day one. So if there's a problem and I need to move it, I'll just move it. Now that said, in terms of how I approach it and how I think about it, it depends on the game. If it's new, I'm probably just going to have to figure it out. There's not really any great way or guides that exist even potentially. So you kind of just have to play it by ear, especially if it's a review copy. Now as for older games, there's usually a dedicated guide that'll walk you through it. So if I'm having trouble, I can just reference something like that. It becomes pretty easy. And when you play games like 10, 12 hours a day on average, it's pretty easy to burn through that stuff pretty quickly. And while some of it might very much so be tedious and force a grind, so to speak, it's usually not that bad, all things considered. But if I run into a problem like an achievement just being harder than I expected or some other type of issue like it being bugged potentially, who knows, then I'll either just hold off, or in the case of a bugged achievement, I'll just note that it's bugged, that kind of thing, and move on. Another part of their question was how much time do I spend in planning versus playing when going for 100%? Planning is very minimal. Either a guide exists ahead of time for it or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, it's usually because it's a very new game, in which case the best thing you can do is just jump in and play it. So I would say planning takes up an incredibly small percentage of that time. Next up, however, they asked a bunch of questions around structuring videos and how I think and approach that. So most of how I structure videos is just straight from viewer feedback. If you were to watch some of my earlier videos, as are actually mentioned in this comment, but if you go watch any of those, they're very different. I used to actually cover the story pretty in depth with these reviews because I was like, oh, a review after 100%, people would want to hear about that. But it turns out no, even in a review after 100%, people don't want the spoilers. There might be a couple, but like 99% of people don't want to hear it, which is something I learned by trying it and being told very resoundingly, please don't do that. So I stopped. So much of how I structure videos and approach it is kind of done from that perspective. I just kind of listen to the general feedback of the people watching them, and that makes up, I'd say, like 95% of it. Beyond that, I just try to be thorough and make sure I hit all the biggest points of a game that are relevant to each individual review. Next up, at Nothing Special asked, do you ever find yourself in a spot where you think I might need to contract out some help with editing or anything? This is a tough question, because on one hand, sure, yeah, I absolutely think an editor or something like that would be very helpful. But the other part of that is that the second I hire someone, this is no longer just my thing. It becomes a very straight up job where I have to make sure that the person working for me is also taken care of. Do I have that work ready for them? Am I checking their work? So while I absolutely think it would be helpful to have an editor or something like that, I also think it's important to me more so to make this channel be my thing. I'm not trying to turn this into some media empire where I have all sorts of employees and I'm basically just another IGN type of thing. I don't want to do that. So while it would absolutely be beneficial, I also don't think it would be able to retain the same feel and approach to the reviews themselves, which is why I don't. At Nickberg TV asks, what made you decide to start the channel, and do I get burned out on games often? I started the channel in 2015 on Halloween because I had nothing going on that day day, I was living by myself, I was working a job I hated, and I needed to do something I actually enjoyed, and what I enjoy is playing video games. So to answer the second half of that question, do I get burned out on them playing the games? No. There are absolutely days I really don't want to make a video though. There are days I don't want to spend time recording. Like realistically, this recording is probably going to take like 2 hours, which is a lot for an audio, but that's because there was a lot of questions. The first part of this video is pretty short. So I get burned out more on stuff like that because I'm not a terribly social person despite the presence on YouTube, which might seem counterintuitive, but if you were to meet me in person, I'm not very talkative. Unless, of course, you want to talk about video games. But with that in mind, I don't really get burned out on video games, no. I might get burned out on a genre and want to play something else, but I'm always ready to play something. At 2Dploy asks, how do I stay motivated to play some of these games? Do I enjoy all of it? And if not, how do I push through till 100%? Do I enjoy every game I review? No, of course not, especially not to 100%. I think that would be crazy. But as for motivation and pushing through to 100%, I mentioned this in my video talking about kind of what I cover and everything that I mentioned at the start of all the reviews, but basically, it's important to remember that as much as I love games and playing them, etc., it is still a job at the end of the day when you're kind of operating it at this level and you're doing it full time. So it's important that I just get it done for work at some point. And because of that and the fact that I'm getting paid very well, that's going to lead me to push through the parts that I wouldn't probably otherwise play. So there are many games since I've started the channel where I probably would have quit at some point, like 70-80% of the way through, so to speak, that I push through specifically for the channel. And if anything, the stuff that I don't enjoy in there is probably going to make it into the review in some form or fashion. But as for the motivation purely, as I mentioned earlier, I want to set an example for my son, and also just plain truth, I get paid for this. At RDK325 asks, in my Forspoken review video, I mentioned that I could relate to living homeless more or less in my past, and can I share my experience and journey from there a bit? So I've talked about this in a few videos, but I grew up very poor. My biological mother was never a very stable person. My biological father went to prison when I was 12. He might get out when I'm in my 40s. And that, alongside a few other factors, led to me being homeless at the age of 15, which continued for about 2 years because I basically just wouldn't tell anybody about it and didn't want to wind up in foster care. And during that time, I would sleep in abandoned houses, crash at friends' houses, all sorts of stuff. Almost nobody knew I was actually homeless at the time. Many of them know now, obviously, but I was terrified of being put in foster care, which is a little bit ironic because at 17, I wound up being adopted by the people I consider my parents now, who are people that I knew previously. So that wasn't like new acquaintances or anything. I had known them for years. But the people I often refer to as mom and dad formally adopted me at 17, kind of once they found out everything that had been going on, and they helped me get on my feet. I joined the army right out of high school, got on my feet properly, kind of out in the world, got a job in retail and sales, and worked my way up to a salaried position, which put me in a pretty good place financially before I even started doing this full time. So that's probably like the quick version, if you will, so I don't drag this part out for like 40 minutes. But I will say in a video not too long ago talking about some games I had a lot of nostalgia for, I go over a lot of details about it. Next, at LarsOl89 has a few questions for me. If I could greenlight one sequel to any game right now, what would it be? That's a tough one actually, but it would probably be Pillars of Eternity 3 for me, just because I really want to know what happens there. But as a close second, it would be Divinity 3, because I really also want to know what happens to the Divinity universe. But realistically, that one's second, because I think that has a better chance of actually happening than Pillars of Eternity 3 does. The second question is there a property or IP I think would make a great CRPG that hasn't gotten that treatment? So I would love to see an isometric Star Wars CRPG. They have, of course, the Old Republic games, but I really think so much of the Star Wars universe could make for a really cool CRPG, and yet all they want to do is tell like the same story with every game they make, and it's always like Jedi, Sith, etc. And like, yeah, obviously that's a big part of Star Wars, but there's so much more going on in that universe, and they don't cover like any of it. So while I don't see it ever happening, I would love to see a proper isometric CRPG set in that universe, provided they could be bothered to tell a story that isn't the same bad guy trying to take over the galaxy controversy like we've seen every single time. I think there's a lot of opportunity for much more localized things, like even say on a single planet or a obscure solar system, that kind of thing that they just don't want to touch, it would seem. And then at Head in the Clouds asks 3 questions. One is, what video have I made that I feel the most proud of? And then what video I made that surprised me with its popularity? And then lastly, if I could add one thing to my favorite game, what would I add? So as for your first question, that would actually probably be my new player's guide for Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. I would be surprised if any of my videos has helped people more than that one has to get into all of the type of stuff that I'm into, like Pathfinder. And that is actually, I believe, the 5th most watched video on the channel, period. And it just has a ton of information that if you're trying to get into Pathfinder 1E, which is an overwhelming system, might really help you out. And because of that, that video has helped out so many people. And oftentimes, so much so that when people are talking about getting into Pathfinder 1E, you'll see people actually link that video a lot. And I'm really, really proud of that one. As for the second question, a video that surprised me with its popularity, I would say my Kingdom Come Deliverance review, which is the 2nd most watched video on the channel at this point. That was just a game I wanted to play and check out because people asked me to do it, and there wasn't anything going on special, like there was no reason for that video to blow up. It was just an old game I wanted to cover, and that review, like I said, is now the 2nd most watched video on this channel, with almost 500,000 views, so that is still very bizarre to me. It's crazy that people watch that as much as they did. As for your last question though, adding something to my favorite game, I would love to add some sort of buff manager to Wrath of the Righteous. It's probably like the one big user thing that isn't there in that game at this point. They've added a lot of stuff, a lot of quality of life changes people have suggested. What's still missing there is the fact that every single time you're about to get ready for a fight, you got to buff up your whole party, and that kind of progresses as you move through the game. So just some sort of in-game buff manager there would be super handy. It is possible to do this with a mod, to be clear, I am very aware, but I would really love it if they made that a base game thing. Next up, at Sam3Drinks asks, what makes 100% an enjoyable experience versus an unenjoyable one? So for starters, I was 100% in games before I started reviewing them, albeit not, as dedicated, so to speak, as I had other commitments, obviously. But now that I do it full time, it's still something I just kind of enjoy as a baseline. But to answer your question a little more directly, what really helps that is actually making the reviews and getting to talk to people about it. Because even if there's a part I don't enjoy, I get to make this big video. It's going to help people decide whether or not they want to buy it. And then I get to have like 200-ish conversations in the comments about it, or I get to read through other people's conversations about it, and I get to learn all these perspectives on a game I might not have thought about or even considered. So even games where I push through it to make the review now, I get to enjoy the conversation afterwards, which is kind of a big part of running the channel, and that's a ton of fun for me, especially since I don't really get to talk about video games a ton in my personal life, as even the people who know what I do for a living, they're kind of not like into video games the way I am, as you might imagine. So having all these conversations online is a ton of fun. Next up, at Sriko asks if Baldur's Gate 3 has the potential to become my favorite CRPG of all time. It is certainly possible. I think it's too early to say for sure. As of right now, Wrath of the Righteous is still very much so my favorite. But I absolutely think Baldur's Gate 3 has the potential to take that spot. It really just depends on how the last few acts and some of the story pans out. So it's way too early to call, but the potential is absolutely there. At M. Fobs asks, can I do a top 5 games way outside of my normal genres? Yeah, sure. I could probably do something like that in the future. That's not a terrible idea by any means. I might actually use that at some point. So yeah, sure. Next up, at Saint Foth asks, am I equally excited for Baldur's Gate 3 as I was for Wrath of the Righteous? If not, which was more and why? I would say I'm pretty equally excited about it. I think, again, it's too early to say like one way or the other because I haven't seen the full game, but Baldur's Gate 3 has a ton of potential, and I'm definitely very excited for it, which is why I'm covering it so much. And then at Wolfgangshian asks, how much time do I devote to whatever game I'm playing, or just how do I manage my time? So I play games probably 10-12 hours a day. I can't do it literally all day of course, especially early in the week when I have my son. So the time management of it varies. I'll usually play as much as I can. I'll try to record when my son's taking a nap, that is to say audio, things like that. And then after he goes to bed at night, I'll do like the editing and things before I go to bed. And then when I don't have my son, I'm basically just home alone all day. So I'll just work as much as I can and get as much done as I can. The daily videos I make though, like the normal stuff, is really only like maybe 2 or so hours worth of work generally, which is mostly down to saving time on my editing by not putting my face in there. I don't use scripts, I write bullet points. I also have a ton of gameplay kind of just ready to go to slap into videos. So from start to finish, most of my daily stuff in terms of making a video only takes like 2-ish hours. And then the rest of it that day is typically either doing anything else I need to do around the house, that kind of thing, or just playing the games, which is really what I try to maximize my time on. And then at Paquilito, I think, not exactly sure how to say that, but they ask how long have I been doing this and was there a point where I adjusted my consistency and saw clear progression. So I've been doing this total for 8 years, like I said, Halloween 2015. And in terms of adjusting my consistency and saw clear results, that was definitely when the Wrath of the Righteous beta dropped. I was excited to cover it and I put out all sorts of videos talking about the classes and stuff. And that was definitely the point where I started noticing that, like, you know, publishing every day, talking about specific things was very much so getting me somewhere because no one else was really talking about that game. And up to that point, I had talked a lot about Divinity and some of those videos had done well. But that was probably the point where I was like, as long as I keep doing this, I should see some growth. Then at WASD Hun asks, how is my son handling my job and what are the positives, negatives about doing content creation? My son, for the most part, really enjoys it. You know, I get to play video games and hang out with him pretty much every day that I have him. And as I mentioned earlier, no one has spent more time with him than me. So that part's been pretty great. If anything, he's handled it very well. I actually have some recordings on my computer from where I was showing him how to use a microphone for the first time and he was like singing into it and stuff. So that was a ton of fun. So for the most part, he's very into it. But as for positives, negatives of content creation, positives are the obvious stuff. I work for myself. I set my own hours, even if they are a lot. I don't have to answer to anybody. I don't have to do anything I don't feel like doing. And the negatives, I would say, are just generally the things like people just not liking you for absolutely no reason. You get a lot of those types in your comments section. People who just hate the sound of your voice, if anything. There's also the administrative side of things, because at the end of the day, this is running a business. So if you're not aware of how to pay taxes when you're self-employed, things like that are stuff you're going to have to work out. And not everybody's cut out for that kind of work. And because I ran a business before I did this for a living, I was kind of already well aware of that stuff. So that wasn't a huge deal for me. But there is an administrative side of content creation that I think gets left out of the conversation a ton, and basically none of that has the upsides of the rest of it. So things like that for the most part. There's also the potential for things like isolation. Like there's plenty of times I don't leave my house for days. So definitely things like that. Next up at Ruin Tabak, something like that, asks, at what subscribers, regular views was I able to quit my day job without having to worry about paying my bills? Subscriber-wise, I was at around 20,000, but I wouldn't pay too much attention to that specific number because for starters, it's not a linear number. So going from 20 to 40,000 subscribers isn't going to magically double the money you're making because ultimately you get paid off of ad revenue. What matters is how much people are watching the content. So the daily views at which I was able to actually pay my bills was around 25,000, but that's also because I was pretty financially secure before I moved into this full time. Like I already owned my house and everything. I also had some money saved up and all that beforehand. So I was never at a lot of risk for me. I would say when I got really comfortable doing this, money-wise, was probably when I was hitting around 50,000 a day. In terms of views, that is. But a lot of that is just going to depend purely on where you live, what your financial situation looks like. So that's a number that's going to vary wildly for people. And that brings us to our last question, which is, why is the channel named Mortismal Gaming and what does Mortem mean? All that jazz. So this is a question I get a lot. I saved it for last because it usually comes up. Mortem is what I was going by online long before I started the channel, and it is death or dead in Latin. So like post-mortem is used to describe someone who sustained an injury after they died, that kind of thing. So I just took the mortem of that and started spelling it with a Y and using that in all my video games and things. Then when I started the YouTube channel, I needed to come up with a name for it, and it was a sort of inside joke with my friends that I would make a YouTube channel and then just be really bad at playing all the video games. So I combined mortem with the word abysmal to make Mortismal. So Mortismal gaming is actually just a joke about me being bad at games, because me and my friends used to laugh at the idea of people making big YouTube channels and then just showing like the worst gameplay possible. Kind of hilariously, the name Mortismal is meant to imply that I'm bad at video games, which to be fair isn't entirely untrue. You'd be surprised how many games you can 100% by just sort of brute forcing them. I certainly don't consider myself amazing at them, to be sure, though. I will say on that subject that I actually really am glad for the name Mortismal Gaming, though, because it's really unique. Like, you hear that and your first thought is like, what the hell does that mean? And on a platform where it's really important to establish branding and identify yourself in a crowd, having a name like that does, at the very least, prompt people to ask me what Mortismal Gaming means. So it's kind of useful in its own way. That, though, is going to wrap everything up. There were a few more questions that were mostly just repeats of other questions, so if you didn't hear your name specifically, that would be why. But if I missed any or you have any other questions, by all means drop them down in the comment section below, and I will likely answer them anyway. That said, I hope you guys enjoyed this sort of long, rather probably off-cycle video, answering some of your pressing questions, telling you a little bit about the channel. But more than anything, as I wrap this up, I just want to remind everybody that I am immensely grateful for the subscribers, the viewership, the fact that you being here allows me to do this for a living, and having spent so much time with my son in some of his most important years. I have my viewers to thank for that, and it really does mean the world to me because I get to live my dream every day. So with that said, thank you, may you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.